we're probably not going to make you endure watching us actually play the game for the remainder.
Yeah, so the following of that video is 20 minutes of gameplay from start to middle of the game-ish. So we start with our character creation and we go through everything. So it adds a little more information on how to play the game.
One of the other things to remember is there is no like wrong way to play the game in a certain sense. Like if you're having fun and you're actually learning things, then it's doing its job. We did design it with a certain flow in mind that we think works pretty well, and the gameplay video does demonstrate that. As when learning any thing for the first time, the first few times might be a little bit slower, but then it can actually go quite a bit faster. One of the things we were aiming for is for the gameplay to take roughly half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. It takes longer than that, especially the first couple of times, because you have to read the cards, be like, okay, this does this does that, this does this. And there's a lot of going back to the rules, being like, what are my options available at this point in time? What are my other options? And there are a considerable number of interesting and surprisingly complex interactions between the various mechanics. Like each player has 3 actions a turn, but there's a lot of different things you can do, and they interact with your fellow players in a lot of interesting ways. So it's not as complicated as the real world, of course, but it does attempt to model what it might be like to have an LIS career.
We didn't demonstrate it in the video, but other things we thought of that could happen is if this was in a class setting and an encounter comes up, allow for the students to have a discussion of what might happen in the real world or how they would face it. Right now in the game, you dedicate advocacy, reach, or credibility to it, but in the real world, what are the different things that could be happening?
We've got a question here. What are the main learning outcomes for the game? Well, one of the things that we can imagine this being used for, let's say you are a library and you have a new hire, and for one reason or another, they might not know what to expect as far as challenges at your particular library. If you have a deck dedicated to this sort, or like designed, built, and balanced to reflect the reality of your particular library, it might be a fun way of saying, oh, we've got a lot of conspiracy theory patrons here, and we have a lot of copyright infringements. So this happens a lot, and you can play through the game, and it's a fun way to be like, oh, this is a thing that happens a lot here, as a really rough example.
Speaking directly to the MLIS program learning outcomes, I think it's about critically engaging with issues in practice in LIS. And the game is, while it has some information in it, it's more about inspiring discussions and encouraging people to work together to solve problems and talk about how that would happen in the real life, in our real lives.
And that's it for our presentation aspect of it. So we're welcome to entertain conversation or questions at this point. You can continue to put them in the chat, or we'd love to see your faces and hear your voice and have conversation around the game.
Yeah, so Helena followed up by saying that encounters are scenarios that you might find in real life library work, and that's exactly what they are. We also encourage people to invent new encounters. Currently, the hardest encounter in our game is the pandemic. So the game is open to building new encounters and adding things to it.
The pandemic amplifies pretty much every other encounter in the game.
So I really love this. Thank you, folks, for putting this on. It's absolutely fascinating. I do have a couple of concerns, I guess, which I wondered if you've talked about. And I know that other people have devised sort of educational games, I think is the pejorative phrase for it. And they tend to be really inauthentic. People either get wrapped up in the procedures or the actual outcome of the process is relatively narrow or thin. So I wonder what you think your game does to, first of all, make it authentic as it possibly could be, I suppose, but also that, and it's following up on something that Helena has already mentioned, which is, what's the learning that's going to come out of this? What's the pedagogical value that will be there, as opposed to the game playing value, which is really a hook, not an outcome.
So I think Sarah and Arielle might be able to speak to some of the more classic sort of things for of the educational value if they want. But I want to take a bit of a different tack for a moment and suggest that one of the possible ways that this can be a really fun learning and teaching tool is in the design process. If you are an educator, or if you are a library professional and you want to contribute material to the game, the actual process of sitting down and thinking about the encounters you have as an educator or as a librarian or what have you, the encounters you have and the challenges you face, and trying to translate that into the system to design new encounters, to design new perks and new skills and new components. That process, I think, would help focus one's thoughts or provide new ways of thinking about things. And there are ways you could imagine getting your class or your employees to try and think up new components themselves. That would also be helpful to the educational process. Would that be amazing outcomes every time? Probably not, but it's another tool in your tool belt,
I think one of the ways that we tried to ensure that the game wasn't too thin was ensuring that, first of all, players have to work together to solve problems. Co-op games do often have a problem of one person they call quarterbacking. So I don't think our game has a specific way that would stop that. So you do have to but it does work best, and people will enjoy the game best if they have a cooperative mindset, because the actions that you take and the skills that you learn really affect other players. So you have to think about coworkers, I guess, or colleagues in how you're going to solve problems, and you have to think about their individual skills and strengths with regard to the current encounters, skills, and strengths. So that is one way we tried to make it less thin. But I think ultimately the value of the game is really in how you play it and how you present it, because it is still a board game and we wanted to keep it accessible, which means that we couldn't make it possibly too authentic. I think that's how I would say. Does that make sense to you, Alex?
Yeah, just to justify Mike's fears for a moment here. I did come to the initial portions of the game design process from a game design perspective. I was thinking, okay, we have these sorts of mechanics. We have a deck, we've got stats, we've got dice, we've got all these different things. We got levels and things like that. And I was thinking, here's the components. How would they interact? What do they do? And then my patient colleagues kept on reminding me, no, we got to make sure this is actually accomplishing educational goals. And one of our early contributors, who unfortunately had to drop out, Chantal Pard, was very adamant about tying in some of the literature on educational games and stuff like that. And at a certain point, I may not have been ready to hear that, but she was patient and helped me through that process and got me to this is my own personal journey of how I saw things. As I say, Arielle and Sarah were already a few steps ahead of me on that particular point.
Yeah, but overall, I would say that the game's role as a learning tool is a framework to have discussions and a conversation starter for discussions, as well as allowing students to play through some of the kinds of you're going to have disagreements about what strategy you should take. but it's a cooperative game, and the only way that you can win is if you work together. So it does teach some like generic sort of teamwork skills.
So one of the main things is because it definitely has this deck-based process, and every time you flip a new encounter, it's in-game you imagine that this is 1 year of your career, here's another year of your career, here's another year of your career. Sometimes you just don't have time to solve or address each problem, and they can build up and build up. And you have to work together and prioritize and say, what needs to be done now? And sometimes it's not the big problem. Sometimes you just have to endure the big problem and get rid of all the small problems that are pinging you away. Sometimes you can, you have to tackle the big thing because it's just making everything so much worse. So different ways of thinking about things have been, we've tried to model that. And because it's, you know, you shuffle the deck, it's a new order of things every time, or you make new cards, it's a new deck every time even. You never know what you're going to get, just like in the real world, and you never know how those things are going to interact with each other. We got a comment here from Helena. Could have students help come up with those encounters. That could be a lot of fun. Actually, that's one of the reasons why I think that the game framework is can be really valuable. Some people will want to contribute from the perspective of, I know about these issues from personal experience, and because I work in a library, archive, what have you, and here's the things we might want to model. Other people will say, I'm approaching this from a theoretical perspective because I've done this research and I have this particular interest, and here's the things that we should model. And some people will come to it from some of the same place that I started, where I want to do a bit of game design. That's the fun part, and that's their in. So that because it's kind of a complex system, there's a lot of different ways people can try and cooperate and think about in this case design, but also think about the issues themselves. I think we're having a pretty good conversation myself.
So I missed this perhaps as you were going through characters, but my impression, and this is going to sound incredibly cynical, so forgive me for this, my impression was they were all nice characters. They all had good attributes. So, remember that real world thing you were talking about? How can you're introducing conceptual problems or physical problems. Interpersonal stuff maybe comes out in the discussion, but you don't have saboteurs. You don't have people who are actively working against these things, or have, maybe a more benign way of putting it is different kinds of stakeholders that have different perspectives. And maybe that's a more positive way to play this out. But those stakeholders will have different objectives as a result. I'm just thinking that might be an interesting, not so much a card coming up, but actually a role to play as part of it. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Just also in terms of character creation, what you saw was us putting forward good ones. Often in D&D, you form characters that can work together. You work together to defeat the encounters. But the way the character sheet is laid out is you choose where your skill points go. So if Alex wanted to use Innovate, which allows you to shuffle discards back into the deck, he could shuffle back encounters rather than shuffling back in skill perks. Or an archivist can take some of the encounter skills. So one of the skills Alex used in the gameplay example was allowing an encounter to have a 50 chance of missing its attack. And he put that on me as a player, so I was safer. But if he wanted to, he could boost the encounters. So you could still have somebody who decides to use their skills for the detriment of their friends.
I will say from like a game design perspective, one, it is a first edition, so we don't have all the different ways that a person could imagine playing it. If you want to design the antagonistic workplace expansion, I will play your version. That would be a lot of fun. Yeah, you could easily imagine modeling like specific encounters, like a disruptive employee, and that might be like a lot of level 1s, or that might be a level 5 encounter, something that just sticks around. It's hard to resolve. Or you could imagine creating an expansion that would be something like unbalanced stakeholders. So you could imagine designing a new collection of skills or something that's for, as is suggested here, the administrator, or the I'm not sure, manager, the CEO of the library corporation, or what have you. These different people might not be cooperative in the same way, but you can imagine trying to model ways in which cooperation could still be advantageous within the gameplay and ways in which it might not. So trying to convince people that the ways in which cooperation is advantageous is still the better way to do things, but how, there's a lot of different possibilities for modeling things in there. So I look forward to seeing your expansion. I will join your mailing list.
I will also note that some of the encounters reflect internal processes that might be negative for the business, like the budget cuts encounter means that however you've set up the multiplicative points to attack, the budget cuts reorganizes them in the way that's prioritized for administrators. And we've been brainstorming ways to try and scale the game up to a classroom size, because right now it's designed for like 3 to 4 players. We really only play tested it with 3 to 4 players. But I think that there will be more opportunities for more antagonistic, or just people who have different outcome, like goals in their outcomes, and for those sorts of things to play through, if we can level it up or expand the game so that you're having more people and more voices in the game at once, and that'll increase the difficulty.
I also have to say that Alex and Sarah had a lot of great ideas for a ton of other encounters, a ton of other skills, and I kept squashing them and saying we need to have a solid base game because we're running out of time. And so this is just a base game. There were tons of other ideas, but we had to get it together for Katie, so it had to come to some end. But there was a ton of other ideas. So yeah, the game is very fluid and flexible and can go in all sorts of directions, I think.
The other thing is, since the conceit of the game is like each card that you flip is 1 year, you don't want the deck too big, because otherwise you're working well into your retirement. So we kept it at about 30 cards. We had ideas. We've got so many ideas for more and more cards, but we didn't want the deck to end up too big.
And we didn't want the game. We wanted the game to be learnable so that you could potentially play like in breakout rooms or in small groups in a 1 class or like 1 hour time. You could have enough time to both learn, start, and at least engage in a few rounds of the game to start discussion. And yeah, as Cora says in the chat, yeah, just trying to help first-year MLAS students learn about the profession, learn about some of the common challenges or uncommon challenges in the case of the pandemic card that they might encounter. Pam's question, where are we planning to go with this? I mean, we released it open source, so at least a lot of the direction is up to the people who choose to interact with it, but I'll let Arielle and Alex, yeah.
Well, I'll just echo what Sarah said. We as far as actual distribution and continuing with further academic considerations of the project, we had not talked about it in terms of making a paper about it. I think we're open to it, but it's just not something that we've really considered. Our focus up until today has been making it and getting ready for today. So if you have some suggestions.
I think at this point too, I would like to see more people play it, whether we print it out, cut it, and give it to a few MLIS students or PhD students that we're familiar with, and get their feedback on how the game plays. Because I think one of the things we realized is that it's wonderful to think of a concept. It's really hard to write the rules for it, to make it clear. And we are very biased in that we're deep in the trenches and we think we understand the game because we created the game, but we don't know if a complete stranger off the street were to read the rules and think it's utter rubbish because it doesn't make any sense. So we would definitely need more play testing for future iterations just to see where it kind of sits right now.
Can we play this game over Zoom?
Not easily, not yet.
Unfortunately, we weren't really thinking of COVID keeping us apart forever. Yeah, we played it in my office, socially distanced, masks on, but I mean, if one person had the deck like I do and you kind of angled your camera down at it, you could potentially work it out over Zoom.
As far as future plans go, we were briefly considering like making nice decks and like selling them at OLA or something like that. But you know, the information is all open source. You can make your own. But if you want to buy these ready-made ones, you know, that's an option. Oh, we got another question here. It would be interesting to see what concepts new LIS professionals come up with versus those who have been in the field for a while. Yes, I think that would be a really interesting difference between the two there. So that would be interesting. I am terrible at cutting things out. I would buy a set at OLA. All right, we got a customer.
Arielle put a lot of work into the design and the graphic design of the cards and making our play deck that we used with like her paper cutter and like accurate measurements. So 3 cheers to Arielle.
It is just clip art at the moment. I tried to convince my husband, who does art, to draw us all the cards. He said not yet. So if we were to go off and make an OLA version, we would stray away from clip art.
So as I've got a question for the audience for a few moments. Imagine you're going to be designing your own character, like design yourself. What sort of skills would you think you would have? Like personally, I think that I would have like 1 rank in researcher and that's about it. Still early in my career, don't really know all that much. Do you have an idea of how you might model yourself? Mike, you were the head librarian at Guelph for a while. Maybe you'd have 5 or 6 ranks in librarian.
What was the category of belligerence? Was that there? I can't remember if that was there or not.
I think that'd be having high credibility.
Yeah, I think this is maybe just to avoid the question, maybe why you want to play it a little bit to try and see whether there are other characteristics that are actually important. And I wonder, and it may be the case that certain characteristics are more critical in one scenario than another. So actually the question I wanted to ask you, which maybe I can then equally avoid the question, is how separated is the game engine, if I could put it that way, from the content side of it? Because I know, if you think about something like a video game, the game engines are almost separate, and you just layer over top of it the actual application, if you will. Have you got the same concept here? Are they? My sense when I listen to it, it's a little bit more tied than that.
Because the different players contribute their reach or their advocacy, and then it's multiplied together in order to create the total amount of impact. That sort of multiplication of cooperation is very unusual in game engines, and it's designed on the basis of the theory in the field of how people working in LIS work together. If you have a person with a lot of reach who cooperates with someone who has a lot of depth of knowledge, you can get that depth to a lot of people. So that sort of understanding of the field is very, very much informed the game engine, as you call it. That being said, there are other components that definitely came from mimicked from other games and could work just as well in any old game. So Arielle mentioned earlier the innovate skill, which is you as a player might have a general skill, maybe 1 or 2 ranks, and trying to come up with new ideas. The way we model that in game is you take a card from the discard pile and you put it back into the deck. Now that action of taking a card from the discard pile and putting that back in the deck, that could be in any old card game. That's in Magic the Gathering, that's in, I don't know, it's not in poker, but anyway, there's lots of card games that do that stuff like that. But that's fine because it's not super critical to the core idea of the game. The main skills, the librarian skill, the educator skill, things like that, they work very much like in a way that's not unique to this field, but exemplary of the field. I think, anyway. I am a bit biased. Moderators have been very quiet.
You've been moderating yourselves more or less. That's cool as well. We're just hitting the hour mark. We still have lots of time. We still have a half an hour scheduled. So feel free to continue asking us questions, or if the audience still has questions, feel free to continue asking our kind presenters anything about their presentation.
I guess to build on Mike's question, my feeling is that the encounters, as an example, are something that is really just like a skin, you know, over something kind of generic. But yeah, like Alex said, the actual engine of it being multiplying and then the sum, so that the sum is greater than the additive parts, was something that we took from LAS. We've also tried to keep the skills within the LAS wheelhouse. So it was more like we, rather than trying to think of good game mechanics and then label them with things from LAS, we tried to think of skills that are important in LAS and then tried to devise game mechanics that would work well within the game. After playtesting, some of them did, some of them didn't. They needed tweaks, but the idea was inspired by what we thought was important as information professionals. And then we tried to devise game mechanics that would fit within the theme rather than the other way around.
Like on that point, some of the initial design was based off of the number 6. So imagine a 6-sided die is something that a lot of people will have. So you have skill caps up to the level 6, the encounters go up to level 6. 6 is a very important number in the way we design things. But it never became apparent that there was a time when rolling a 6-sided die would be useful to model anything that we wanted to do in the game. So that sort of random chance sort of event just didn't fit for any of the skills or encounters or anything else that we thought of. So yes, there's a couple of cases where you need to like flip a coin, do 50-50, but there's nothing that specifically calls out a 6-sided die, despite the fact that it really was designed with that in mind. So.
If I can ask a question, do you have a sense of the setting that these encounters are taking place in? Is it a public library, academic library? Did you keep it generic? And I'm also wondering, in terms of LIS, did you think about sort of more information management rather than sort of typical library science issues?
So what I will say to that is our initial deck is a smattering of things from all over the place. We have, copyright concerns. We've got library budget cuts. We've got fire and flood. So there's things in there that affect the research environment, the academic library environment, the public library environment, even archives. And that's so that you have enough cards that you could just make copies of a couple of them, and now it's focused in one particular environment, and you still have a 30-card deck roughly. But the default is very much an abstraction of LIS as a whole. It's who knows? You're everything, but it's really easy to tailor it to. This deck is the public library institution deck or at least my public library institution deck. That's why we have, 5 fire and floods in here, because we burn down every month. I don't know why we do that, but we do, I guess.
Yeah, just I guess to speak to that from a different direction, the core statistics of the game are advocacy, reach, and credibility, which we call ARC points. So the roles make most sense if you think about, or the title skills, I guess, make sense most if you think about them in relation to the skills of advocacy, reach, and credibility. So credibility is a skill that we give to all information professionals equally. And it's also the skill that is, or they're also the points that are the most high value, because if you run out of credibility, you can't take your turn. You have to skip your turn. That is like, we can't survive without it. Whereas advocacy and reach are things that we can regenerate and spend more easily. And the idea is that, or the way that we've framed it, is that researcher educators are more tied to, I'm going to say it in reverse by accident, but researcher educators are more tied to advocacy, and then librarians and what's the one? Public servants are more tied to advocacy. No, reach. Wait. Did I get it?
Reach.
Okay, so the idea is that people who have a more public-facing job are more connected to the reach skill, and then people who have a more policy-oriented job are more connected to the advocacy skill. But I hope in future game designs we can include more like information professional jobs and try to figure out how those jobs might use a hybrid of the different skills in different ways. But we started with just sort of like some of the main career or more common career objectives for information.
Yeah, keeping it small because it is a base game. We had to actually finish it and have time to play test it.
I will say it is a fun game, which is like that didn't have to be the case, right? Like educational games sometimes hit or miss on the fun part, but it's actually fun and engaging. And sometimes when you see two things interact, that comes out of the gameplay organically, you're like, oh, if this happened in my library, oh, that would be bad. So that could be a way of, triggering some additional thoughts of this thing that we didn't think is like super important. Like it's like a 3 out of 6. If it happens at the wrong time, it's like a 6 out of 6 in terms of a problem. So
an example of that is we have a level 1 conspiracy theory patron who is not much. It's a 10 on the impact scale. You could probably deal with them pretty quickly, but they amplify. So one of their skills is amplify, and they increase fake news by 10. And so we have fake news come up multiple times. We actually have a level 10, 20, or 2, 3. And so if you had a level 3 fake news already out in the open and suddenly your conspiracy guy comes along, he's now a level 4, which is a lot harder to defeat. And so some of these things interact with each other, which you might not be thinking about, but in the real world, suddenly you have your conspiracy guy outside your library pushing against all this fake news that you've been advocaatly trying to decrease with your skills. And so they do interact with each other in interesting ways. Not all of them do, and I think that would be an interesting thing to push more in future editions and things, just to try to get some more of the things interacting with each other.
Yeah, we did try to design the game to be winnable on a first try. So it isn't too hard, but I can imagine like if you wanted to give yourself a real challenge, you could say roll a die at the beginning of every turn. And if you roll a 6, now you're going to have 2 new encounters this turn instead of just 1. And then like, who knows what's going to happen, because that is what it is like in the real world. You don't get 1 new thing a year. You get like the pandemic. You can't fight the pandemic until you are yourself have had, I think, 4 promotions. And so you have a certain number of skills already that are equal to the level of pandemic. Whereas if I was a brand new librarian and the pandemic hit this year, I don't get to have 4 promotions before I fight the pandemic. It happens right away. But
before we had that in place, I think that was in the game where I rage quit with my husband because we got all the hard ones right away, and they kept decreasing our credibility, which is essentially kind of like, in our minds, health points. And we just couldn't win the game because all these hard things came up right away. And that's no fun. And so we wanted that element of simplifying, like making it so that you don't have to fight the pandemic in your first round, just to make it a little easier.
The balance of modeling, well, there is a balance between modeling reality and facilitating fun gameplay and even educational gameplay. It's hard to strike exactly the right balance, but I think we struck a good balance at the very least.
So Arielle mentioned pandemic and, the COVID thing, right? So what's the thought about how you're going to develop this over time now? The idea of not merely selling it at OLA, it would be great for you to road test it at OLA or at a lease or somewhere like that where you could actually let people play it and gather that feedback. But my sense is COVID's going to make that a little hard in the short term. So let me ask the awkward question, which is, could you make a digital version of this? Could you do this a different way?
I think we could. I mean, the cards are already on the computer. It would just be a matter of figuring out some sort of code or already app that you could input these cards into, and because you can play solitaire on the computer, I'm sure we could figure out how to do the same thing with these cards.
Yeah, Helena mentioned in the chat. Is it Helena or Helena? Sorry, I'm just pronouncing things without asking. Mentioned Board Game Arena. I'm not sure if it's free to upload custom decks, but really, besides the deck, as long as you can see what cards are currently in play, then you can play it online.
I have briefly considered trying to code up a thing in Python or something like that. No, I'm not going to. I am not skilled enough for that. But it's open source if someone wants to. Just have to give an attribution.
I guess I have one question. What led you to develop the arc points, or like what made you decide? Because those are the three like main skills, right? The advocacy, reach, and credibility. What made you decide on those three as a sort of like? I guess they're really like the three things that information professionals do, quote unquote.
That was an iterative process. The first thing we noticed, the first one that we came up with was credibility, though I don't think we called it that quite at first. It was, we understood that if it is going to be a role-playing game, and we originally imagined it as without a deck, but with a game master, and we go through the world as a team, encountering stuff that the game master invents in one way or another. So we imagined we needed some sort of equivalent to hit points in a role-playing game, something like that, and that's what credibility was supposed to do for us. Once we moved away from that and decided, no, it'd be more fun if there was like a deck-based thing, and we could have everyone playing on the same page. We realized we needed to, also we really needed to simplify things. Like I kept on coming up with crazy extra ideas, and Arielle was very kindly and gently said, that's great. Maybe for an expansion, let's keep it simpler. So we settled on, as I say, 6 ended up being a very important number. So 3 is half of 6, which makes it a reasonable number of core statistics to base things on. So some of you will be familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, where you have, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Cool. That's one way to model a person. one's physical attributes tend to be somewhat less important in this field, hopefully. So we instead thought about, okay, once it became clear that you are trying to, as a player, influence the people, the public, to care about this and that, we tried to think about, okay, we will have an impact on the people. And then there was the idea of impact, and that kind of got split into two ideas of reach and advocacy. For a while there, our concepts of reach and advocacy were the reverse of what we currently have, which is one of the reasons we keep on getting confused as to what one means what. But then we thought about it a bit more clearly. It's like, no. Reach is how many people you get, and advocacy is like how much you can convince some people. But like we had this kind of archetypical model in things like Dungeons and Dragons, but we had to change it so much that it's became its own beast.
I think we eventually settled with advocacy, reach, and credibility also because they make a really nice acronym.
Yeah, arc point sounds cool. Also, credibility came directly from the hit points in terms of, well, what's our health stats? And because we initially were just going to take Dungeons and Dragons, and we were going to take all of the stuff from there and just map out libraries onto it. And so we started with that idea of what are our skill points, what are our stats. And as we started workshopping it, and I sort of realized that it's great that we in our D&D group have Alex as a DM, but a DM is a position not many people want to take, because it requires knowing the game really well and having the ability to tell stories, and it's hard to find a DM often. And so I wanted to stray away from the idea of DM, which started to pull us away from Dungeons and Dragons completely and started to bring in other concepts. And so it was really evolving. And then, yeah, one of the things that my biggest contribution was just telling Alex, that's too complicated. It needs to be easier. And so it was a lot of brainstorming, a lot of flipping back and forth and deciding what we wanted to do and how we would call things.
Great, thank you so much. So we have 15 minutes left. Is there more questions for our presenters?
I don't think we put it anywhere, but if any of you try it out and it's overly complicated or way too easy, we would really appreciate feedback. But also if you get stuck and you need clarification of the rules, that's really helpful for us to know to tweak the rules, but also we can help you understand the rules so that you can enjoy the game. So we are available by email to help with any of that, or just to get feedback on how it plays.
Yeah, we did our best tech editing, but games are really hard to write, it turns out.
Our emails are available at the front of the game packet document, so we are pretty easy to reach.
I don't see any more questions. Does that just that the presenters have anything else they'd want to say?
I mean, I'm sure we could talk for another 12 minutes, but I don't think we have to do that.
No, not necessarily, no. So let's thank our kind presenters. We give them, sorry, I should turn on my video. So let's give our presenters a round of applause. Yay, congratulations, that was great. There's a lot of work that went into that presentation and to developing that game entirely. So I think it'll be an interesting pedagogical activity going forward. I think it's an interesting idea. So please join us for future sessions of the conference. There's about 6 to 10 left. You can find the rest of the program at case2020.ca. And everybody, please enjoy your Thanksgiving weekend.